This episode explores the healing power of community. Welcome to another episode of Art Heals All Wounds, where we explore the intersection between art and well-being. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. How do you hold on to a history of a place when the demographics of an area change? When the history is no longer held in the collective memory of the community? If you're Mildred Howard, you embed a story about that community in a piece of public art. Mildred's work, usually large works in bronze, reference histories of communities of color, unions, and artists. She often incorporates poetry by favorite writers into her work. There's nothing frivolous about Mildred's work, but it is almost always quite whimsical. Imagine huge objects in unexpected places. In this interview, she tells us the story behind a giant picture frame that you can stand in on a hillside overlooking the San Francisco Bay, and giant bronze keys rising from a sidewalk in downtown San Francisco. She also shares her inspiration for 2 new pieces of public art she's working on now. When she creates a piece, though, she isn't just looking back in history. She thinks a lot about the community that's there now, how they got there too. Engaging with Mildred's public art is like walking through a portal into a space that is both past and present combined. Mildred Howard is a mixed media artist who creates works large and small, using materials such as household items, photographs, glass, bronze, and much, much more. She shapes work that goes beyond just catching your eye. Each piece asks, "What do you see here? Are you paying attention?" It's important to know a little of the backstory of Mildred's family. The youngest of 10 children, Mildred was the only one of her siblings to be born in San Francisco after her family moved there during World War II to work in the shipyards. When Mildred was 3 years old, her family moved to South Berkeley. The Howards became a very prominent family in Berkeley due to the leadership and activism of Mildred's mother, Mable Howard. If you want to learn more about her leadership in Berkeley, you can see the film I made about Mable Howard called Welcome to the Neighborhood. But one big takeaway is that in the late 60s, Mable Howard brought a successful lawsuit against the Bay Area Rapid Transit, known as BART, to force it underground through the primarily Black neighborhood of South Berkeley, just as it was in the rest of Berkeley. In our conversation, you'll hear us talk about a public work for the Ashby BART station in South Berkeley, and we'll reference Mildred's mother, Mable Howard. No one had ever brought a lawsuit like this against a giant transit agency, and no one expected an African-American grandmother to win that lawsuit, but she did. Although the community wanted to name the station after Mable Howard, BART refused. The fact that Mildred is now creating a piece of public art at this BART station is incredibly significant and is a great example of how the roots of Mildred's work run deep. When I had this conversation with Mildred, she was in a space with some noise in the background, which you'll hear a bit of, but it doesn't detract from the stories she has to tell. Before we meet today's guest, I want to tell you about an app called Newsly. Newsly is an all-in-one audio super app for iOS and Android. There really hasn't been an app like Newsly before now. Newsly picks up all of the trending articles on the web and reads them to you in a natural human voice. You can find any topic you're interested in: sports, politics, or art. I've loved using this app. I listen to it when I'm commuting or when I'm gardening or while I'm cooking, anytime where I want to catch a little bit of news, but my hands are full or I can't stop to read. You can also find trending podcasts from over 50 countries on Newsly, including Art Heals All Wounds. Newsly has become my go-to listening app for podcasts. If you want to try Newsly yourself, just download it from www.newsly.me. And if you use the promo code ARTHEALS, you'll get a free 1-month premium subscription. I'll include all of this info in the show notes so that you can just click on the link and use the Art Heals promo to get your free trial. Now, let's meet this week's guest. Hi, Mildred. Thank you so much for being on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. Could you start by introducing yourself by telling us what you do?
Sure. My name is Mildred Howard. I'm an artist living in West Oakland, California.
And you have an enormous body of work, and you work in a lot of different contexts as well, and with a lot of different media. So before we talk about a specific art project, I wanted to ask you, when did you know that you wanted to be an artist?
I don't know if I even realized what the term artist meant when I first started making things. I just realized early on that I was interested in creating things, whether it be dancing, designing clothes, or making art. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I realized that art could even be a profession.
Well, you and I know each other a little bit. We've known each other a few years. And I know that in the past, you've told me several times that it was the community you lived in that first got you started in learning about doing creative things.
Well, yes, because I started off dancing when I was 3 years old. 2 doors from my house was a congregational church where I took dance classes. At this same congregational church, I was able to take arts and crafts classes and go in almost any time I wanted to make things. And at this same church, which was really progressive, and in the 50s, to have a church that was integrated was considered unusual. But most of us there thought that was the way things were up until we went to school. And that's when, because if I was, under 5, this is what I was exposed to. And in addition to that, that's the way my household was. And even though on the television, I can remember blasting about the McCarthy era and other things like that, I was really too young to understand really the depth of what was happening, even though I can remember that vividly.
Wow. Well, it is interesting because you talk about your household, and your mother was a very famous and influential activist in Berkeley. And so you did have all of these different people coming to your house. So we're going to go into your art, but can you describe just briefly what it was like at your house as a child?
Well, as a child, we also not only were politicians and people from various parts of life frequented our house, but we also had foreign exchange students who lived with us.
Wow.
Yeah, I think 2 Russian students lived with us then.
Really?
Yes. At that time in South Berkeley, the neighborhood was somewhat integrated, even though it was a red line community where African Americans, Asians, and Latinos could only live below. It was called Grove Street. It's now Martin Luther King.
Right. And your mom, I just realized this when you were talking about this, your mom herself, she restored antiques and had a huge interest in art, didn't she?
Of course, she taught art in Galveston, where they lived before moving to San Francisco for the WPA. She taught arts and crafts classes.
Wow.
And yes, she restored antiques and collected and sold antiques along with my father. So they were team together until he passed away.
Right. So, as I said before, you have a lot of works, but one thing I want to talk about are your public artworks. I think most people who live in the Bay Area have seen some of your public art, whether they realize it or not. And I'm wondering if you can talk about your public art a little bit. When you get hired or commissioned to do some sort of public art, what motivates you and how do you decide what that project is going to be?
Well, one of the things that I've always been interested in history and in memory, but I'm also interested in the now, like what is happening now, what was in the past influenced what we see today. And there's several projects that I'm working on. And one is in the Hunters Point Bayview district of San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess there are three that I'm currently working on. Another on Stevenson Street in San Francisco, which is privately funded.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third is Berkeley, California. So those are the three public projects that I'm working on. In addition to doing that, I'm always working in my studio simultaneously on my 2 and smaller 3-dimensional works. And so this is all necessary because public art takes years sometimes to complete. And so as a maker and a thinker about art, I'm constantly in that kind of mode of working.
Right. And I remember the first project you did at Hunters Point, you were done. When you say it takes years and years, there are so many things outside of your control. So you were done and ready to go, but you had to wait then a long period of time for them to get it installed.
Yes, I think it was maybe even a year.
Yeah.
It was probably 6 months to a year that I had to wait because the land around it was being developed. And the entryway to get to the piece where this piece was going to be installed had to be cleared and paved. So, and it's just not about the artwork. It's about the other development, whether it's housing or street change or whatever it might be that's happening simultaneously. And as a public artist, you're constantly working not only with the public, but also the community, because you want the community to feel a part of what you're doing and for them to know that it's not just about me, the artist creating something. It is about me, but it's also about how do I reflect that community or pay homage to that community while I'm thinking about what to do.
Could you talk more about both the first project you did at Hunters Point and then you said you have a second project that you're doing there?
This project is a large, maybe 22 by 21 foot frame by 5 feet that opens and frames the landscape both north and south. And you can also from one section see the Bay Bridge on one side. You go to the other side, you see the peninsula and parts of the East Bay. In fact, you see parts of the East Bay on both sides. And it's just like a picture frame that you might use to hang on your wall, except it's huge. And on the backside has hooks and everything as if it were going to hang on the wall, but instead it stands freely. I proposed several projects for this, but at the time I didn't know that Hunters Point the name was changed, and I think it's called The Point. It's something different. It may not be The Point, but it's no longer Hunters Point. And that, to me, later I realized, okay, the narrative is being changed for whatever reason. But when I think about that place, it's a community that has been in transition. At one time, it was the Hunters Point area was where they had the meat packing section. So there was a large, I think, Portuguese community there. During World War II, or even before, African Americans started migrating to the San Francisco Bay Area. Hunters Point Bayview and the Western Addition, or the Fillmore in San Francisco, were two of the only communities where African Americans could reside. and many of them worked in the shipyard. So my idea is, okay, now that this community is changing, how can I address some of those issues? How can I guess, frame who these people are and acknowledge them and let them know that they're the real art because they helped to build this country, they helped to build this community. Many of them worked and helped to build ships and work on ships that were used during the war. And many of them lived in the housing projects around there. So I wanted to acknowledge them and their wealth and who they are, that when they walked through that frame, it was about them. That's why I did that. So not only the people there, my parents worked there, half of my family worked there, and relatives worked there. And within that, I had a grandmother who was a chef at a restaurant nearby in that area. And so it's just about paying homage to them, just saying that you're worthy of standing there on this land and letting others see how important you are.
Well, I've seen that project. You took me to see it, and I had no idea that that was part of your thinking in creating that.
Well, prior to that, I had made these large, probably 18-foot letters that spelled out Hunter's Point. And they were both somewhat like a puzzle, but they were lying down. And I wanted them to cover a whole area. But for some reason, that wasn't accepted. And so I had to come up with another idea. And I'm of the mindset that just because someone else doesn't like it, it doesn't mean that it's not a good project. It just means that these people who selected it feel that something else should go there. So that's another thing you have to take into consideration when you're doing public art. But I almost always have the community from which I come represented in some kind of way.
Mm. Well, what is the second project you're working on there?
Is on 3rd and Evans Street, the Southeast Community Center. It's a new center that's being constructed. I think it's 3 stories. And for years, I've been collecting African currency because I was just so fascinated by the currency. And currency is different than money. I mean, yes, money. I mean, both are medium of exchange. But also the currency can be worn for adornment, and it can be used as a weapon or as a tool. And I find that extremely interesting because many people adorn themselves with jewelry. Everyone from older people that wear tons of gold and earrings and across cultures, but to the hip hoppers and the rappers who have the gold teeth in their mouth, the chains around their neck, all of that. So I was thinking about that, all of those kinds, that community that wear their wealth on their body. And yes, the currency is from Africa, but adornment is universal. Universal in the sense that it's representative of the people who now live in Hunters Point. So a large Latin population, Asian population, and African American. At one point, and now just recently, younger whites are moving into the area and see the change and what's happening. So what's going to happen to those people who've spent their life there and have nowhere else to go when the average price for an apartment, a 1-bedroom, is probably over $3,000 a month. Aside from that, the Bayview Hunters Point has some of the best weather in San Francisco and some of the best views. It's close to Bernal Heights. It's close to Dog Patch and Potrero Hill. Those were also communities that were extremely diverse that have now changed. An apartment in Potrero Hill 1-bedroom can go for over $5,000 a month.
That's insane.
It's insane what's happened to the San Francisco Bay Area. We have, on one hand, and I'll get back to talking about that piece, but we have on one hand those of us who can afford a place to stay. and on the other hand, an extremely large population of homelessness. And in a country, in an area that has so much money, and in a state that has so much money, there's no reason for it. There's just absolutely no reason. So back to the currency. The African currency that I'm using as a prototype to scale up to 18, 16, and 14 feet is reflective of the people who live in that community. And it's to show the wealth of talent and the history that exists in that community. So much of what we know about San Francisco comes from communities like the Bayview Hunters Point or the Western Addition. And I wanted to acknowledge that. So that's one of the pieces that I'm working on now, 3 large pieces of African currency. The second piece is on Stevenson Street in San Francisco. In the early 2000s, I was invited to participate in a call for artists, and I was selected to do that street over. And that's a street that I lined with skeleton keys in a escutcheon plate and benches that were made like a padlock. And the skeleton keys are open. The key is in what we call an escutcheon plate. And it's in there so that it's a welcoming to the city. And the lock is open, meaning that our door is open. I did that piece as a tribute to Harry Bridges, who was head of the ILWU. And that was one of the first unions, along with the United Auto Workers, to have a diverse group of people working and invited into the union, of which 3 of my brothers and my father, longshoremen. So that piece now is being done over. When I did that street, it was just very few businesses. In fact, I think maybe 1 or 2. And now the street has changed. So cars are coming in and out of that little 1-block alleyway. Trucks come in because it's also the entry to the Four Seasons hotel and condominiums. And one of the things that happens is when the trucks go in, they turn around, they back into the keys get bent. And so now the street has to be done over to meet the needs. And the developer came back and said, we would like for you to redo this street. And I put a team, an architect, a landscape architect, a structural engineer, and a project manager. I brought all of those people together to form my team to do the streets over. When I was working on this, I was invited to the Atlantic Center for the Arts to be a master artist during this whole period. So while I was there was a poet named Catherine Smith who wrote poetry that just took me on this visual journey. And as a result, when I got this opportunity, I called her and asked if she would write a poem that talked about Stevenson Street. That's another reason why I did the keys, because the longshoremen did not want to dock because of not being unionized. And so there was a riot. Is it Bloody Monday or Bloody Thursday? I can't remember which day of the week it was. But also that community was a large Filipino community, especially where Yerba Buena Center of the Arts. And then the Filipino community moved out to Daly City and South City and those areas. And now there were at one time a lot of workers. Not far from there was Levi. If you continue going out Mission, was Levi Strauss, where Levi's were made. It's just a real weird. And Yerba Buena now is called the Yerba Buena area, because there are all these museums. There's the Jewish Museum, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of the African Diaspora, and hopefully soon the Mexican Museum. And it's the corridor to all of these places. So the street has a poem that will run the length of that square block with new light arbors and a bench and landscaping. So that's an ongoing project that I've been working on probably for 7 years. And it's been on hold for 2 years because of the pandemic. So hopefully it'll get done. And the third project is in Berkeley. I was invited to do a piece for San Pablo Park. San Pablo Park in Berkeley is another one of those communities where at one time, especially at San Pablo Park, the whole block, except for one or two houses, were African American, and primarily educators and lawyers and doctors lived around San Pablo Park. You could take dance classes at San Pablo Park, you could play at the rec center, just all kinds of things. And people would, the Negro League played ball at San Pablo Park. So it was a place where we would walk down to see the Negro League baseball when I was really a tiny child who played there. And then there were friends all around there. At one time I knew almost on one side of the block, almost everyone in every house. But now that's changing. The older people are dying out. I guess the younger people can no longer afford to keep up with the taxes or for whatever reason. So I proposed a different piece of African currency for that. And at the time, I didn't realize they wanted something that was more utilitarian, something that could be used. So I didn't get it. Maybe 2 years later, they came back and said, we really like this project. We want you to do it at the Berkeley BART.
Oh.
I mean, the one that my mom initiated the suit and won. So in front of the BART station where Martin Luther King meets Adeline, that point, I'm proposing a 10-foot circular piece of African currency.
That is so fantastic.
Yeah, so I'm pretty excited about that. So when I go back and I think about community, I get so much from them that I'm compelled to give back in so many ways because it's just so much information that I use in my work that inspire me. I mean, it both inspires me and at times makes me angry. What I'm trying to do is to do something positive.
Well, as you can imagine, I am so excited about the project at the South Berkeley BART station.
Yes.
Yes. It's formerly known as the Ashby BART, well, still known as the Ashby BART station.
Right. It shouldn't be.
No.
But right now I'm trying to think of a title of that piece that will incorporate my mother's name into the work.
Well, that is so exciting. Mildred, if people want to learn more about you and find out more about your work, where can they look?
I haven't done a website yet. I should do a website, but I haven't. But if they Google Mildred Howard or put me in on YouTube, there's a lot of information they can find out. Also, I'm represented by 3 different galleries. Anglum Trimble in San Francisco, which is located, I guess, in Dogpatch at Minnesota Street Project. So it's Anglum Trimble. Parish Heinen in Los Angeles, and Franklin Parish in New York. So they can contact any of those galleries or just Google my name and they'll find out more information. I also have to just say, Pam, that in doing all this, I still have to pay tribute to Native Americans who this land belongs to. And enough cannot be said about what's happening to them in this country still. Yes, we can all say, it has happened to African Americans, but I just have to pay tribute to them and tribute to those who had the land before, because much of this belonged to Mexico. And in my last talk I did at Stanford, instead of just think when the Day of Absence that was written, I think, in the 60s, when all Black people left the planet, what would happen if all people from Mexico left the planet? So we're all in this together.
Well, Mildred, that's what I appreciate about you. I hope you know how much I appreciate not only your work, but your friendship.
Oh, thank you, Pam. My nephew just found my triple great grandparent and her name. And next to her name was Africa, where she came. So we're now able to trace our family back to Africa. born to the late 1780s or 90s.
What was her name?
Annie. That wasn't her name. That's the name she was given. And the slave owner's name, Gail. So they came into South Carolina, and from South Carolina to Georgia, to Mobile, Alabama, and then round the Gulf to Matagorda County. I'm here because of her.
That's an amazing thing to contemplate, really, the life that she must have experienced.
And she was young, because she was very young. I think she was just maybe a young teenager. United States needs to pay for some of this.
They have a lot to answer for. We have a lot to answer for.
All have a lot. Really, it's very serious.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for your work and also for your very, very big heart.
Oh, thank you, Pam. I'm glad we're friends.
Me too. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Thank you so much to Mildred Howard for being on this episode today and talking about the relationship between community and her public art. If you want to learn more about Mildred, Google her and read some of the articles and interviews with her. You'll find lots of images of her work as well as YouTube videos. Mildred is truly a visionary, so I hope you'll acquaint or reacquaint yourself with her art. The music you've heard in this podcast is Yellow Light District by Lobo Loco. Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 15 in D major was performed by Karine Galanian. The music you heard in the intro was by Ketsa. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. Thank you for listening to this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. I'd love to hear your feedback. Reach out to connect on social media. If you want to learn more about each artist and the backstory of the episode, sign up for the newsletter at arthealsallwoundspodcast.com.